Well, good afternoon, at 2 minutes after noon. It's very nice to see many of you here in this room, and a few of you are also joining us on Zoom. And I'm Uta Poiga, I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, and the Dean's Office, together with the Humanities Center, has really for a decade organized the Faculty Works in Progress series. And Faculty Works in Progress we take seriously. I'm very, very happy to have Moira Zellner, who will be introduced by Jenny Stevens shortly as our first speaker. I just want to remind all of us, these are really supposed to be talks where one is at a stage where one is still ready to get some comments and shift one's thinking potentially. They are very consciously also interactions across disciplines. And I think all of us who have presented in this series have found it useful, in fact, to get comments from different disciplinary perspectives. So thanks to all of you who are here. Thanks to the Humanities Center for taking the lead in organizing, Laurie and Gabi. Also, if next time you consider coming here, the Humanities Center, the Dean's Office, do give you takeaway lunch, but we will all continue to stay masked here and will at most sip on our drinks and will very much enjoy interacting in the room and with those of you who are on Zoom together with Moira. Jenny, could I turn to you then?
Great. Well, thank you. Great to be here, and it's my honor to introduce Moira Zellner, who is a professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and also the Director of Participatory Modeling and Data Science. And Moira came to Northeastern just last year from the university.
Year.
Sorry?
January.
This year. Okay, sorry. Yeah, last academic year, but January 2021. And from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And Moira really represents so much of what we're all about here in terms of collaborative, participatory, interdisciplinary, and it's been such a pleasure over the past few months to actually work with and be alongside and collaborate with Moira in so many ways, and she's really getting involved in a lot of things, and we're so lucky to have her. She got her PhD and her master's at the University of Michigan, and her undergrad in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And with that, we're really looking forward to hearing about your research, and great that some of us could be here in person. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, and for those who are on Zoom as well for joining us. So I know this is work in progress, and it is still work in progress, even though I'm going to present a few things that you probably you might have seen before. But just a little bit, because I do like to show a little bit about the trajectory of where I came from and where I'm heading, given where I came from. So from a long time ago, my main motivations have been really addressing big, complex environmental issues that have to do with sustainability and resilience. And a lot of my work has been on drought and water management, but I'm moving into other big critical issues like wildfires and extreme heat. And so what I've done with my background, which is a mix of ecology, planning, complex systems, thinking, and modeling, I essentially focused a lot of my work on creating these modeling tools that can couple human natural systems to address questions of what is sustainable growth? Can we ever achieve it? Is there an urban pattern that is sustainable? How effective is green infrastructure to address climate-induced problems in urban neighborhoods? What's the balance between local interest and regional environmental goals? How do we manage floods and droughts also in agricultural areas? So I focus also on other areas beyond cities. So I do a lot of the work, or a lot of my work has been on modeling coupled human natural systems. And so I wanted to give you, this is part of the interactive part of the presentation, just a quick review of some of the models that I build on, which are called agent-based modeling. And so again, as a way to show the kinds of tools that can be used also in collaboration with social sciences and humanities. So if you think of exurban areas, where all of these, this big blob of green just represent an exurban area. Somewhere the lighter green just represents like, higher ecological quality that people would normally look for in these areas. And a center, which is, like kind of a commercial center that suddenly crops up, out there in the suburbs somewhere. And so you could have run simulations that essentially show how residents come in and they're looking for two things. One is, being close to the light green and the natural beauty in that area. That's what they're there for. But also, they don't want to be so far that they can't find things, right, to shop or food or whatever. And so they also try to balance this proximity to these red squares, which are the commercial centers. The commercial centers, on the other hand, are also following the residents, because they don't want to be like somewhere where people are not going to get there, right? They're looking for a market. So they follow each other, and so every time I run this, it will be like a slightly different history, because there is some randomness to it, and there's this feedback in both directions. Now this is if we assume that people essentially prefer or like, give equal weight to being close to natural beauty and to proximity to these centers. But what if they actually have a very different preference, where they don't care about being close to the red squares, they care about only natural beauty? The emergent pattern from that, is where the complexity comes in, is a very different one. And what they're following here is just like the light green, right? And so wherever the light green is, that's what the pattern, it's very much determined by the environmental situation or condition. But what if I have yet another feedback, which is when we develop, there's environmental deterioration. What do you think will happen next?
Less green.
Exactly. So what's happening here? We have the same preference, right? They only want to look for the light green because they are only concerned about being close to natural beauty. In doing that, they degrade the environment so the bright green is further and further and further out and more difficult to reach. It ends up being a totally different pattern that emerges, but also overall deterioration, right? So let me go back here. So I've used these kinds of models to try to address, and this looks like a toy model, but I can adapt it to specific environmental and social conditions using and informing it with data from decision making and data also, environmental data, and to try to come up with answers to some of these questions. So for example, growth is not sustainable no matter what shape it is in. There are thresholds and layouts for green infrastructure that make it more or less effective. So beyond a certain threshold, it doesn't do anything. Above a certain threshold, it starts doing it, but space matters. And other things like, collaborative preservation, and that it can arise even under development pressure, adaptive crop decisions, and other things that I've published over the years. So my question is that it's an amazing tool, right? These are wonderful approaches to informing planning and policy, and yet it's now being widely adopted. And so what I've seen, and this is part also of the deliberation and conversation with Scott Campbell about this, is that there seems to be these three different stages of complex systems reasoning in planning and policy. And so the first one is like, we acknowledge our world is complex, we know that, but we don't understand it, right? And so it's kind of like this black box, and that's where we stop in the description, okay? There's a second stage, which is, using some of these models to try to understand and really look at the complex system and how it behaves and what makes it behave in a certain way. Sometimes we get there. So there are some people in planning who are actually very sophisticated models, and not just agent-based, but like other kinds of modeling approaches too. But the third stage is like, how do we really incorporate the understanding that is developed through modeling in planning and policymaking? And that's the hardest and the biggest, highest hurdle that still exists. And that's where I move into, which is like this idea of really connecting the interventions that we are planning for with plausible outcomes through the modeling process. But this also involves engaging other people in the modeling process as well, to be able to see all of these interacting dimensions and for them to be part of the modeling process and understanding. And the reason I say that is because typically, we are kind of trying to move away from this model, but this is typically the model that exists, where the experts are on one side and the stakeholders and policymakers are in the other. And they don't necessarily interact much at all. So the policymakers have this demand, and the stakeholders have this demand for like a future that they want or a future goal. Typically, that goal is growth driven. Okay? And then with that goal, they go to the scientists and say, I want a model to see how we get there. Okay? Or what are the consequences of us getting there. And so then the modelers go and do their thing on the side, and then they come back and they give results. But then how do they trust the results? Well, they trust them if the model is accurate. And so there's this impetus to make these models very complicated and accurate and sophisticated so that they can give numbers as results essentially and just give best estimates and predictions. The problem with that is that there's little chance there of have like a more integrated discussion where we also discuss our values, because we cannot really get to an understanding of the inner workings of a system if what we're seeing is a result of a black box, okay, that then respond to the demands for accuracy. So instead, what I've been trying to propose over many years is this integration of modeling and policy making, where we're all stakeholders. So the modelers, the scientists of different kinds are all stakeholders in this process. And it becomes this co-evolving, joint learning kind of process that leads to more possibility of joint learning, and not just of the biophysical complexity of a problem, but also the social complexity of that problem as well, leading to promoting more integration of different forms of knowledge, and a discussion of, do we actually even want growth, given that we know that we understand what the ramifications of that is. Now, there's challenges to realizing this vision. On one hand, communication across expertise, different, not just different scientists, but different kinds of actors. So public actors, private actors, they come from different backgrounds, and sometimes, talking is, we talk past each other, oftentimes. Spatial thinking and computer modeling can be daunting to a lot of people. The one that I always enjoy talking about is confirmatory bias. I've seen this many, many times, where I can have the best model in the world, but if whatever the outputs don't align with what people believe in, they start questioning, no, it's wrong, there's something, let's explore it. I can have the worst model in the world, but if the outputs align with what I believe in, then I don't even question it. It's a good model, right? So there's always that problem there. And then the other one that I think is key for planning and policy is this idea of like the difference between consensus building and generalization, in the sense that we tend to focus so much on consensus building that then, in order to avoid conflict, to achieve consensus, we end up generalizing our recommendations to a degree that they don't mean anything anymore. We got to be sustainable. Who's going to argue against that? But what does it mean? When we actually start planning things on the ground, and I say, okay, we've got to rip up this highway, no? And we've got to put green infrastructure, right? Why would anybody be against that? Of course, there would be problems there, right? So there's a lot of friction, actually. But if we're going to avoid it and then get into this generalization, we're not really going very far. So that's where I started shifting to really looking at tools for participation. And the questions about how can complex systems modeling help us learn, and how does this learning lead to better decisions, right? Because ultimately, that's what we want to do. It's not just learn, but also do something with that learning. And so this is just an illustration of what I mean here. So these represent two different neighborhoods. So if you can follow me here, like if you see yes, you can see the cursor. So these are representing streets around blocks, urban blocks that have an alleyway. The dark gray are buildings, and the light gray are, like, say, patios or driveways. These are sewer inlets. And this is a neighborhood that actually has this sloping in this direction. So what you see here is darker is the area that gets flooded. So this is based on a model that I developed. It's process-based and represents urban flooding in some neighborhoods. And so here, what you see, these little icons are rain barrels. They represent rain barrels that are put everywhere in the neighborhood. Here, these are like bioswales or vegetated gardens or rain gardens, if you've heard that term, to try to capture water in this area and try to address this issue. So with no green infrastructure, of course, there's no investment, so the costs are zero. But every time it rains, these areas, these buildings here get flooded, and that represents about $39,000 in damages per storm. And then 62% of the rain goes to the neighborhood downstream through the lowest point here, right? When we have rain barrels, we invest over, say, 20 years of the life of the rain barrel, $14,000. It doesn't make much of a dent in reducing the damages, and nothing, no difference in terms of how much of the rain goes downstream. When we put bioswales, we spend much more over 20 years, but we also reduce much more per storm. So if you think of 20 years of storms, that's a lot of money. And it also reduces the runoff downstream. So here's another part that I always ask, a question I always ask is like, which one is better? Which scenario is better?
Bioswales.
You say bioswales. Why do you say bioswales?
Because the environmental impact is better, and if you care about that, that's the end of the story.
Exactly.
But if you extend it over time, you even out your cost benefit despite the initial expense.
This is already evened out, right? So that's a present value of 20 years, so it has installation and maintenance over 20 years. The same with this one, right? Anybody? Yes, please.
So I'd say better for whom, right?
Exactly.
So if I'm the politician trying to get reelected in 2 years, that longer term view might not be better for me.
Exactly. Or you have in your budget just, $15,000 to spend or whatever the, implementation, cost is. What if you're the person living here in this corner?
Yeah.
No matter what, I'm always flooded and I'd rather not spend any money, right? Why am I gonna put my taxes towards this if I'm not gonna get any benefit? So this is to say that, again, simulations are not enough to come up with answers. Why? Because there are trade-offs. And you are making this gesture, right? It's exactly that. There are trade-offs. There are different costs and benefits for different people at different times. There could be also spatial physical constraints that add to the cost. Like I cannot dig rain gardens everywhere. There are utilities, that just add to the cost. And of course, there's also the diversity of stakeholder interest. So there has to be here not just a solution building process, which through the simulation, but also a support for a compromise. Because we all want to do the right thing, but we have different ideas of what that might be, right? And so we needed to build, this was with my team, this support for compromise to happen, which can let us evaluate where we stand, okay, what are our preferences, and sometimes we are not aware of what our preferences are. And then also where other people stand, and being able to include then a way to measure this, and so that we can compare and contrast our different needs and how different solutions address our different needs. So allow us to then look at the problem space and also be able to playfully explore that problem space and come up with solutions. So we came up with this participatory modeling approach that has different components. So it's still centered in point 3 here with simulations and agent-based simulations, in this case of flooding, but it could be other things like wildfires or other kinds of complex problems. And what we did is we added different kinds of interfaces that help people engage with the simulation, because just doing so through the computers was just, again, it's too daunting for a lot of people. So we have like paper maps that represent a neighborhood. We have wooden tokens that represent different kinds of green infrastructure in this case. And then people come together around the table and they create scenarios together, green infrastructure scenarios. And then what happens that you'll see here, they have iPads. Each one of these iPads allows them to rank their preferences. So for example, you were giving the example of depending who you are. If I'm the policymaker, I might put investment costs at the top. I want to minimize that. But if I'm the hydrologist, environmentalist, I might put, infiltration up top, right? And so those translate into weights that then are applied to the results. And so when the simulations are run, there's another app that takes a picture of the scenario, it runs a simulation, and when the simulation runs, it produces results that are sorted based on your preferences. So you're going to look first at the things that you care about the most, but then you can also see, other kinds of variables. And the other part here that we have, I'm sorry, it's a little bit small from the people here in the room, but essentially what it does is that for each scenario that you try, what you're going to see is what my valuation is based on my weights, but then also contrasted with somebody else's valuation of the same scenario. And so you see they may be different. So this first one here, which again, sorry, it's too small. Here it's all rain barrels. So the first column is for the resident. It doesn't do much for them, so they don't value that scenario very highly. This one, guess who's this one? The second part. The public official. Why? Because it's really cheap, right? And so they really like that particular scenario. But what this allows the conversation to be like, or be directed towards, is being able to see like, okay, you know what? These first two scenarios, they're just not good in general. Let's move on to the ones that seem to give us greater benefit given our preferences. And then you can zoom into particular scenarios that, do we go for one where our benefits are kind of like equally distributed? Or do we go for one that gives us collectively more, but it's more unequal? And then maybe we can do something about that. Can there be like compensation? Can there be extra taxes? Like, whatever is needed in order to address that inequity. All of that deliberation feeds back in a collaborative setting to understanding first, like, okay, how water flows through the landscape and how do we, intervene in it so that it doesn't flood as much. But also it could make us question our own priorities and our own rankings of preferences once we understand where other people are coming from. And so that happens too. And all of that then builds into this iterative cycle in a workshop of 1.5 to 2 hours, where we collectively design solutions and evaluate them. And this is also done through, structured facilitation. So what we see is that there's definitely evidence of learning, innovation, and compromise. People are able to look at this space and kind of like talk about those trade-offs. You gain, but I lose. What do we do about that? Engage systematically in exploring this space with the help of the facilitation. And then, well, I use a lot of gesturing, but gesturing and mental modeling as well. So even when they recommend things changing or make suggestions about how do we change certain aspects of the, say, green infrastructure specifications or things like that, because they learn how to, they understand now how the water flows through the landscape, they can actually anticipate what the effect is going to be without even modeling it. So even if it's not represented in a model, just from being trained to understand how the system works. And then finally getting to the conclusion, in this case, that green infrastructure cannot locally solve a problem, that you need a much more coordinated approach in order to do that. Another aspect that I very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, is that we also developed a method to actually look at how people learn with these tools. This is, say, like different meetings, and these codes represent what they're talking about. And so we can see, like, the progression of, say, talking about the model because they're becoming familiarized with it, to talking about the implications for the real world as they transfer the lessons learned from the modeling into the real world. So what are some of the main takeaways for this part? That this is definitely an aspect of collaborative design, of working with stakeholders, a long-term relationship building. And there's a lot here that still needs to be researched in terms of how do we do that effectively, especially within collaborative meetings, the role of facilitation. And how do we structure the facilitation or like the activities around these tools in order for the conversation to move forward and be synthesized. It's very hard, I've done it, to, on the fly, try to synthesize what everybody's talking about just around one table. When you have like more tables, forget it, it's just insane. So are there ways, and this is a question that we're working on, what are some ways in which we can do that more effectively, maybe with artificial intelligence and other kinds of approaches that can help us quickly look at what people are talking about and making sense of that. And then moving away from consensus into compromise and really thinking of how do we support this deliberation of what is it that we give up when we choose a particular solution? Who gives it up? Who is it affecting and what do we do about it? Okay? And then really thinking this is a scaffolded process where participatory modeling is a point of entry to the problem, to other tools that may be more accurate, to different kinds of interests, being able to understand that diversity, and to other complex problems. We won an award for this work, and we are very much expanding on this to take it online and scaling it up. Because again, as I said before, trying to do more than one table of a few people, at a time becomes kind of unwieldy. So I wanted to just show you a different approach of complex systems modeling, and this is newer to me. And this is also based on, this is also based on, that's spoiling the story.
It's okay, I can't really see it.
Good, hold on, because I want to move this and it's not letting me, there we go. Okay, there we go. And so, so this is like based on a conversation that we had in BARI, in the Boston Area Research Initiative, and there was some work that was coming up from data analysis where they were seeing this relationship between gun-related events and how they increased during COVID, but then at the same time, interestingly, violent crimes that were not gun-related decreased during the pandemic. Okay, and what could possibly explain that? So it was already an interesting finding from the data. But I tried to do like an exercise with them to try to show like how can we look at the causal links here that would explain this weird thing. So me being totally naive to the problem, I have no idea about guns or anything, like their effect except for they read in the news. That's it. And I'm like, well, from my naive perspective, I could say, like many other people might say, that there's more gun crime because people are using guns more because there are more guns, right? So I use this technique, which is called causal loop diagram, to say, like, okay, the blue arrows mean that there's a direct relationship. So if guns go up, the use of guns go up, gun crime goes up, okay? But of course, that doesn't tell the whole story. There's also a relationship with social capital. And here, the red arrows mean an inverse relationship. So I can say, part of the discussion with the BARI group was, well, as social capital increases, the use of guns decreases, and the gun crime also decreases through that relationship. And so this would be like the perfect thing to study with Daniel Aldrich, for example, and like looking at that relationship. But then what feeds into social capital? So, okay, so on one hand, there's this relationship between social capital and vulnerability, where it's a self-reinforcing mechanism. So the greater social capital, there would be less vulnerability, the less vulnerability, the increased social capital, and that's a self-reinforcing, but it can go up or it can go down. It can be a death spiral too. And then what could precipitate that? Well, if there's a crisis like with the pandemic, that decreases the access to resources. As resources go down, social capital goes down, and that activates this downward spiral, right? And that in itself, also social capital has this effect on community surveillance, right? So as social capital goes down, so does community surveillance. This might increase other kinds of public violence that are not related to guns. And then also, we stopped there. We didn't continue, but but there was also this idea of like highly trafficked shared spaces, and that these two should also probably be related. So if you have highly trafficked shared spaces, you also have, in this case, less. So it actually should be opposite here. Should be less non-gun-related violence. Now, these are causal diagrams that are very useful, and I will show you an example very quickly on how I used it with a community to help them understand, trade-offs in a particular situation they were in with flooding as well. But again, not used as much in planning yet. even though these techniques have been around for a while. But again, the causal loop diagrams can help us conceptually map something, but they cannot help us with simulations. For that to happen, we've got to think of system dynamics modeling. And these are, again, like another way of representing complex systems, where the stocks here of guns are like buckets or bathtubs, if you will. And you got like a faucet and a drain, right? So the inflow is a faucet, the outflow is the drain. And so the inflow into this particular bathtub of guns is the purchases of guns. The outflow would be like the removals of guns through the system. How is this done? Well, it's done with different relationships or different influences on it. So the purchases will be a function of like the demand for guns, which is also mediated by price, but also there might be restrictions, there might be laws, right? And we might implement that, restrict that. And then the removal might be a function of how many guns there are, but essentially there might be a confiscation rate, there might be buybacks or other kinds of programs that are also in there, and as well, guns breaking down and at a certain rate. So that would all be part of like the outflow of guns. But then there's also social capital, which could also be a bucket or a bathtub. And you've got growth and decay, and here's where I would love to have Daniel talk about that. But you can start seeing like where the links might be that might provide these feedbacks that make then for this complex dynamic that could explain, not just that guns increase, but the relationship with gun use, as the gun use is mediated both by the amount of guns and the social capital in the system. And there can be a particular gun use rate and so on. And the social capital would then also feed back into the growth of guns through the demand. Like as social capital grows, then there might be, lower demand. So just to give you an example of, what an approach like this could be used for. Let me just double check quickly. I want to start wrapping up. I go back to here. And again, that was in 30 minutes, we have come up with, just kind of like that representation, both representations. And of course, it takes a little bit longer to parameterize the system dynamics model in order to start getting simulations, but you can see how that can be part of a process of iterative modeling with stakeholders to try to build this, a representation, a shared representation of the system that can let us explore questions of what does it make sense to do here? Do we put some kind of market-based incentive? Do we put some restrictions? Do we build on social capital so that then it feeds back into the rest of the system? What do we prioritize? Okay? So what I wanted to share, again, very quickly, is that I applied this approach, the causal loop diagramming, to an area in the south side of Chicago, low-income neighborhood, that had huge flooding problems. Every time there was a minor rain, 140 acres of the place just, flooded. Why? Well, they decided to do something with the river there and made it like a straight, 90-degree bend. So every time there's a little bit more, runoff from upstream because also there's more development, it just floods the whole thing. And long history of divestment in the community as well. So the sanitary district was trying to build a stormwater park in the area and wanted to do this in collaboration because they saw it as an opportunity for economic development. But the conversations were stalled. Due to the long history of corruption and stuff, there just wasn't trust in this project. They didn't understand why they, what exactly was asked of them. What was asked of them was to tell them, okay, what do you want in the park so that you can make money out of it? But essentially, there just wasn't a good conversation there. So we went in and we actually engaged in a causal loop diagramming process with the stakeholders to try to understand the relationship between flooding and what would it take for them to be happy, healthy, and safe. That's the question that drove the entire process. And we came up with a collaborative design of this system, looking at how flooding, essentially as I was telling you before, the red is inverse relationships. So how it depressed economic development and also depressed these goals. But then how that feeds back into the ability of a community through development to generate a tax base that then will support other kinds of services, how this becomes a virtuous cycle in terms of reinforcing the economy, and then that can provide services that keep everything in check, including the flooding, and then all of these reinforcing the happiness, health, and safety of the community. And the interesting thing is that when we engaged in this conversation with them, first of all, I mean, we had worked with key stakeholders to generate the design of the workshop and made sure that this was something they wanted to do. They did. We went ahead, we had this workshop at the community level, and it made a huge difference in what happened moving forward. They started talking, they started understanding, because they could link and understand the interaction effects in the system, why it was that certain things were necessary, and what were some of the unintended consequences of some of the things that they were wishing for, because they were able to make some of these connections visible when before they couldn't. And so they started to use this diagram and this way of thinking to negotiate trade-offs, to support their own innovation, and really take ownership of the planning process and of the tools themselves. They would say things like, we've done positive diagramming, we can do it again, let's do it again. They really wanted to just keep working with these tools. And this really cultivated a sense of advocacy and self-reliance, so really also building on their own ideas and their own resources. And as I said before, this was a relationship building process and collaborative design where we are working with them and not for them. We're not going in there as consultants. And so it really enabled this cycle of continuous adaptation. Okay, so all of that is what I've been doing. The first part is more solidly what I've been doing, with database modeling. I still continue working on that and creating the interfaces. The second is also using other tools like closed loop diagrams and system dynamics and trying to think of what are ways in which we can support that. And I've been doing a few more projects with that approach to try to tease out appropriate approaches to using these tools. And then, just referring to some of the articles that I collaborated in together with other participatory modelers, with whom we're trying to kind of establish this as a field. And I think it is already established as a field in itself, where we set out research and development agendas for participatory modeling. But what am I doing? And what am I focusing on right now is this idea of how do we scale up and scale out? And how do we do this going virtual? So part of it is I'm developing this platform to try to translate some of the experiences that I shared with you onto an online platform. What would that entail? And how do we continue doing that well and building on some of the specifics of what we gained by doing the in-person workshop, but again on an online setting. And in particular, I'm trying to focus, as I was mentioning earlier, on the role for artificial intelligence in trying to help facilitators navigate this space to quickly make sense of what the conversations are about, especially as we're negotiating trade-offs, what trade-offs are we zooming into, et cetera, to try to help advance the conversation and the facilitation structure forward. In this also, there's a lot of work that we've done in terms of assessing learning, which is great. But there's a big hump between learning and doing. And what is it that we do, and how do we assess the quality of our decisions? How do we know that the decisions that come out of this process are actually better? Okay, so that's the other aspect that we're building on. And then, of course, the design of tools and processes. But what is important about these is that the funding landscape also needs to change. And I'm saying this after many years of frustration with some funding agencies that may think that this is wonderful outreach, but it's beyond outreach. It is research. It is really generating a new area of knowledge of how do we do this effectively to really advance back and go back to my big questions. How do we address these big social and environmental problems that we have in a way that really, we're kind of running out of time on a lot of them. And so we've got to move forward. How do we do that better with some of these approaches and tools? So it's a lot of work and a lot of just sweat and tears sometimes. But why do I think it's worth to do this? And I think it is because we really do need to change some habits of thought and practice that distract us from seeing new possibilities. So what we're trying to do, what I've been trying to do is to create ways of visualizing not just complex biophysical processes, but also complex values, complex social conditions that empower us to see differences and work with them instead of just pushing them back, thinking of consensus, but no, let's work with conflict, let's work with differences. And where then models, interfaces, facilitation structures support this collaborative exploration and co-evolution of understanding and valuation. So understanding of the complexity of the problem we're in, that we're part of, but also how do we evaluate it together. And that in the innovation then is in the relationships with others. And I would add not just the innovation, but like the quest for equity is in the relationship with others. And here the tools serve as a prosthetic device that support that thinking and that collaborative thinking. It's a technical enhancement, not a technical fix. So again, we're not offloading. The idea is not to offload the computation to a machine and then a machine just comes up with a number or with an answer. Humans have to be very much part of that process. It cannot happen without social learning. And so this has huge consequences in terms of, like the capacity for us to come up with novel solutions, but also to support a healthy democracy. And being able to work with difference rather than trying to eliminate it, and then thinking like how planning tools, policy tools, and social protocols around their use can support that kind of deliberation. And this is, again, like why I think this is critical for democracy, especially in the age of misinformation and disinformation. How do we counter that? I think that this is an approach that can do partly that, and then also towards resilience and sustainability as well. So I work with a team, lots of different kind of funding sources for this, but thank you, and I hope we do have some time for questions. Do I stop sharing, Gabby?
Say again?
Do I stop sharing?
Yeah, you can stop sharing.
Okay.
And how do we get the questions out of the chat?
I'm looking at them now. We don't have any right now. Those are just messages from me to the audience.
And
Yep.
can we see the gallery of people in the
Sure.
chat?
Yeah.
Be nice to have our colleagues visible to us.
Why don't you make the chat visible too?
May I ask a very basic question? Well, we're thinking of more interesting ones. I assume there's some kind of definition of what a complex problem is, and I just was wondering if I don't know it.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I should have started there. A complex system essentially is a system that that is composed of different parts that interact with each other in selective ways, leading to nonlinear emergent patterns of behavior. So an example was like that urbanization model that I showed you, where the interactions you cannot really compress the description of that model. You've got to actually run it. So essentially what's happening there is you've got residents and you've got commercial centers and they're interacting with each other, but they're not thinking of anything else but like, I just want to be close to nature and the commercial center. And the commercial center is like, well, I just want to be close to the market. That's all they're thinking about. But then a very different emergent pattern or organization pattern emerges based on those interactions and then also the feedback. So it's a feedback in both directions, but also the feedback from the environment.
Thank you.
So you have all of these nonlinear interactions, yes.
Thank you, Moira. So I don't know if this is a kind of philosophical question or practical question, but models by definition are kind of simplification, right? And they're insufficient to represent anything because they only include whatever modelers decide to include, right? And then the participatory modeling then allows to open that up to, but it all matters who's participating, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I guess my question is like, as you think about scaling up, are there mechanisms to imagine kind of, or is that what some like crowdsourcing ideas are to get participation from a lot of people without this very intensive, time-intensive, you know, meetings?
Right, so,
I'm just trying to like
yes,
connect it
no,
with like
totally.
other.
Totally,
Yeah.
because we made a lot of mistakes, along the way. Because there wasn't, when we started doing this, there wasn't really much out there, right, in terms of this area of work. So the issue here is like, one of the things that we learned is like, the meetings have to be like at most 2 hours, each meeting. And from each meeting, the participants have to take something out. They gotta get something out of it, okay? Because even if this is the only meeting that they make, it's not about us getting, us, whoever, us, I say that is the researchers or whatever, or the policy makers, getting information from them. It's them, particularly them, getting something that is useful for them out of the meeting as well. So that's the way that they design. Before we were thinking, oh, there's a series of 4 meetings, and then at the end, no, that just does not work well. So we really focused on self-contained exercises that's the only thing that they do, at least they get something out of it. And then usually what happens is that they come back, and they bring other people back as well. So the idea would be to think of this as an ongoing iterative process, but each one of these meetings would be self-contained. And we're also thinking of combining synchronous and asynchronous modalities as well, to allow for people who can't make it to a meeting to still be able to contribute and be part of the process. I think Uta had a question.
So, Moira, is the Robbins example then an example where you actually had learned that and where that worked? If you could just tell us a little bit more concretely, like what are examples of what you're saying makes so much sense, that there needs to be something in it for those who are even participating. And I'm just interested in what were the concrete things that you could plan to give to people, and perhaps also what were the unforeseen things that happened in that example.
Right. So with Robbins, yes, we had learned that already, and in fact, this was so our portion was the one that I showed you, but we were actually also working with some of the planning agencies and the sanitary district and so on. And in conversations with them, there was also a group of landscape architects who were wonderful. They were such great team players in this. They totally got what we were talking about. And so we designed a lot of the workshops together, especially with the landscape architects, because they understood that idea very quickly about like, this workshop is not for us to do our job. This workshop is for them to own this project. Okay, and to be part of this whole project design. And so we did make sure, so this is a nerve-wracking part of this, which is it's a totally open-ended process. Talk about unintended consequences when you are modeling a complex system, that's a feature of it, it's that all these ramifications because of feedback. Well, this social process is also very much open-ended, and in that sense it's nerve-wracking because you've got to adapt on the fly and see what works, what could work for them, and in trying to achieve the goals for this stormwater park. And so we were just doing like one step at a time. The first step was like, okay, we're gonna try this causal loop diagram and see how it works. And so we engaged with the key stakeholders who finally let us in, when we were just developing our relationship with them. And I just went like, okay, what are your aspirations? What do you want to do? Like, what are your concerns? And then say like, okay, there's this approach that we don't have to do if you don't want to, but do you want to try it? They wanted to try it. We tested it with them. And I said, okay, what do you think? Does this work for you? Do you think? And they gave us like amazing feedback in terms of how to design that workshop that made it successful. Without their feedback, I think we would have fallen on our faces, like, flat, just not work. And so then it worked, and they got excited. They became advocates for the project and for the process, and they were able to bring more and more people in. But we were always designing things with them. And so the next workshop was more of a, I didn't show it here, but it was more of a, more traditional, using printouts of the area so that they could put post-its in there of like what they wanted. We had specific questions that the architects needed to know, and so we asked them those. But then I think like what was even more important towards the end, I was really keen on like just making sure that they could come up with their own strategies of how to use this park and how to build this park over time. And so I essentially asked them, like part of the conversation was, what are your resources? Who are your people who can help with some of these things, these strategies that you have outlined, like overall strategies, but like how do you make them happen? So what are some of your resources to do this? And they came up with just brilliant ideas that they felt like just empowered because they were their own. And why wouldn't they feel empowered? They were great ideas and with their own resources. So they actually were able to outline a pathway forward of, with their own resources and their own ideas. So all of that to say, it's like, for me, that was the guiding principle of just making sure that they got something out of it every single time that we met. But then really just building and facilitating the process of their own, their own creation, their own design of some of these solutions. So that has to be there. But it's very much an open-ended process because you never know how it's going to go. And we got to adapt. Yeah, I think I need something.
So I just think it's fascinating to hear you talk about how you're weaving thinking about participation and participatory processes into model, right? And so I have not done it with modeling, but I've done it in other scales and at other levels. And one of the things that our teams struggle with a lot is social desirability, right? And so you're working in a space with values and equity. And so there's a lot of social desirability in sharing your perspective.
Right.
And so at a smaller scale with a smaller group of people that are in a room, part of the way you tackle that is lots of time in that room together to slowly build trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious how you think about social desirability in the modeling processes that you've been doing, and particularly as you scale up, right? Because, I've been thinking about sort of the crowdsourcing approach, right? How does social desirability play out there, right? There are clearly socially desirable responses, say, around racial equity.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily always reflect someone's internal processes and right?
Correct. Absolutely. That's fascinating. And I think that this is precisely where this kind of modeling can help. Because oftentimes, I think that the equivalent, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think that the equivalent would be, I have an idea of what a solution to our problem is.
Yeah.
I have put in my preferences. We have a shared representation of, Latin or whatever, you name it, whatever it is. You run the model with a solution that you think is going to work, and then you run it with other solutions that other people are proposing. And then you see that your solution actually fares out really poorly, even for your own preferences. Okay? So that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
That actually can happen. And it's frustrating for the participants, right, if they did not expect that, because it's a huge dissonance. And we've got to figure out how to navigate that dissonance in a way that they don't disengage.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens then is like, oh no, your model's wrong. Or no, there's something, this is not right. And then I'm not interested, and they disengage. So that's another very important aspect of this work, which is how do we keep people engaged even when they are faced with this dissonance, and they say, no, I want, equity or whatever. But then when you actually play out, okay, how should the system work? And then they can see, well, it actually leads to more inequity. Those are things that they can, that this process can help them confront, in a productive way. But again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to just make sure that it doesn't become a huge conflict, but actually that there's a way to support that kind of deliberation around understanding. And so one thing that we do is, in providing the weighted, that bar that shows how much they value a particular scenario, they have different colors. Each color represents a particular variable. So they can actually break it down into the variables that are contributing to that evaluation. And so they can start to understand that, okay, this, I actually like or don't like this scenario, even if I don't know that I like it or not like it, because of these and these variables. And so they can start understanding at least how to tease those things out. And so we think, I mean, we still, again, like, there's a lot more to do here to study, but there is something in that process of making sense of that complexity that helps people maybe get unstuck from some, fixed positions into a more productive space of deliberation.
Thank you, Moira. This is fascinating, and it feels revolutionary to me to intervene in the field of modeling by introducing multiple participatory inputs and continually revising the modeling process based upon, I mean, it's an iterative and dynamic process. But the refrain in your presentation seemed to me, when they let us in, the challenge of letting us in, and if this kind of participatory modeling becomes a kind of field norm, it has kind of infinite applications. So I'm just wondering about that challenge of, are you forming consulting companies? Are you intervening at the level of government and public policy? Like, where do you make your, I mean, here we are sitting in the academy, at an institution that's talking about impact engines. So it just has me thinking about how academics have come up with a new way of addressing social and environmental problems, and the intersection of social and environmental problems. And yet there's, here you have this resource, it's in development, it needs spaces where you can try it out and play out the ways in which the dynamic works. Do you need a business?
Like, that's a great question, and I've thought about that. I've actually thought about that. The idea of forming a business is just like too daunting.
And it's not what you do.
Right,
So
it's
that's
not
really what I wonder about is, how do we take this and then give it to whom it needs to be given so that it can be.
Because it's very niche.
Yeah.
It is, but at the same time with like.
I don't think it's niche.
It's
I
not
think
niche.
I think it's very.
Well, that's what I'm.
Yeah, we're all talking about the same thing.
But it can really pan out,
Yeah.
and that's what we're looking for. So, on one hand, what I often advise when I'm talking to people who want to engage in participatory modeling is like, it's about relationship building. And really, that's what the focus should be. It's about being able to build relationships, and we use these approaches as a way to support that relationship building, but really the focus is that relationship. And that's where, I mean, I meant to be respectful. I did not mean to be like, demeaning in any way when I said like, let me in, because why would they let me in? I mean, who am I?
That's
right?
my question.
Right, so, but it takes all of that, like, I do it with passion, because I do believe in it, and I do believe in the people that I work with. And, one of the things that I always say is like, that particular project is like the most inspiring to me, and the stakeholders were like really inspiring to me. And, but it's really about being able to just try and try and try. And when you ask me where, anywhere, everywhere. So that means government, community, consulting, company, whatever. I'll keep trying. I'll keep trying all of those spots, and I just keep at it.
That just feels like a waste of your brain. No, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be glib, but
I'm totally open to hear other suggestions on how to do this more effectively.
I think there's no other option, right?
That's what I think.
But I think
Poking until you get a.
right, but I think there is a real question about scalability, right?
Right.
And how, I mean, I think what you were saying so clearly is that it needs to be quite context specific and needs to rely on relationships. But there is, I think, the question also, I mean, obviously you've been building apps, but are there also some things that you're learning about? I mean, you said something about the workshops, for example.
Right,
Again, I would still love to hear the more detailed examples another time.
yeah,
But I agree with Lori. What we were saying is so compatible with what the university is after right now, right?
right,
And it also strikes me as having pretty similar ambitions to what the GovLab, I don't know about what the Burns Center is doing, but what the GovLab is actually trying to do and the kinds of successes that it has had. But the question is, whether what you are providing is actually more deeply community co-created and engaged than a lot of the things that are going on there. I mean, it's also something that it seems to me, there have been certainly some of the critiques of the policy engaged work that we've done through the Global Resilience Institute, right? So again, I think some of that could be taken into those spaces, but it does indeed mean that you also, I mean, and probably you've done that, Moira. I have obviously not looked at all your publications and everything that you have said, but it seems to me like toolkits for doing this kind of work need to be part of the output in order to be able to scale, right?
Moira and I at GRI and Steve Flynn and others, a whole bunch of people are putting in an application next week for scaling up community climate resilience toolkit, participatory.
Right, okay,
So
excellent, okay.
It's a good team. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
yeah. So we're definitely building into the proposals that have been part of, just kind of like, and again, in different ways, because that's part of like transforming the funding landscape that I was talking about.
Right.
Right. National Science Foundation hasn't really been the most open.
Yeah, but foundations might be more open, right?
Yeah, so we're
than
looking
the
into
National
that.
Science Foundation, so I
Yeah.
think Sharon and Lisa should definitely be involved in this as well.
Yeah.
Looks like our colleagues
Moira.
on the,
Yes.
let me turn to Laura.
Yeah, I see people packing up their bags. So first, I just really want to thank you, Moira, for a very stimulating and engaging presentation that gives us a lot to think about, and to thank everyone who is in the room and those people who joined us on screen for attending the first in the Works in Progress series. We hope you will continue to come. We hope you will be motivated to come in person, because it's so nice to be in a room with people again and be incentivized by the fact that there is takeaway lunch. So everyone, please do take away your lunches. And it falls to me, Director of the Humanities Center, to remind everyone that our next such presentation is at this hour at noon on Monday the 18th. That is in 2 weeks. A fascinating panel organized by Tom Bacino and Lisa Lincoln on learning from the work of the college's multi-generational research teams. So we're very excited about that, and we hope to see all of you and encourage others to come. And thank you for being here, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.